Oh, hey boys and girls. Welcome back to Friendship Kids. I've sure missed seeing you guys the last couple weeks. I'm sure you guys have heard, but Miss Bethany had a baby, and so Mr. Chris is a little tired. But I'm excited to jump back into our story. Just hang on 1 second. 1 second, I'll be right back. All right, guys. Well, I think it is time to begin. Now that you've met baby Karis, I want you to know what baby Karis's name means. Charis is the Greek word for grace. And I'm so excited to jump back into our big redemptive story this week and learn more about the grace of our God as he makes a covenant with David. I know it's been a couple weeks since we've gone through our story, so we're going to review here in just a second before we dive into this week's lesson. But before we go any further, I want us to pray together and talk to our God. So go ahead, close your eyes, and pray with me. God, we thank you so much for your goodness to us. We thank you for your love, for your grace, for your faithfulness. We're so thankful that we can continue to learn about the big redemptive story of the Bible as we continue this week with the story of your faithfulness to David. I pray that as we learn this week that we'll love you more from this story. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so it's been a couple weeks since we've met together. So I want us to review and remember what we studied a couple weeks back before we jump into today's lesson. So let's take a look. All right, well, if you remember from a couple weeks ago, we were introduced to our big picture question. And it is this: how is Jesus the perfect king? We've seen that Saul wasn't perfect. We've seen that David isn't perfect. But boys and girls, Jesus is the perfect king, and he perfectly rules over the universe as the King of Kings. Wow. Even today, Jesus, he has never one time sinned, and he is right now ruling over our universe as the King of Kings. There is no one greater than him. But as we saw a few weeks ago, we are right in the middle of the story where Israel has a human king. They think that a human king is better than God being their king. Well, we've seen that Saul was not anywhere close to being a perfect king. He sinned, he did his own things, he disobeyed God, and so God chose David to be king instead of Saul. The last time we met together, we saw that David wasn't king quite yet, but because Saul knew that David was going to be the next king, Saul hated David. He tried to kill him many, many times. Well, if you remember from the story last time, David had a chance to finally kill Saul and put an end to all his worries. But you know what? David showed mercy. He showed Saul that he was merciful to him and that he was not going to do him any harm. Saul admitted that David was a much better man than he was. That story taught us David showed mercy even though Saul hated him. And this week, boys and girls, though we will soon find out David was not close to being perfect either. He also sinned. And so David was not going to be able to deliver the Israelites from their greatest enemy, which was their own sin. David battled with sin too. But the good news is that God made a covenant, a promise with David, that the one who would deliver them would come from his family. As I've already mentioned and we've already seen, the path to the throne of Israel was not an easy path for David. Saul had tried multiple times to kill him, and David, he fled for his life. He even left behind his good friend Jonathan, who was Saul's son. But God, he had appointed David to be king. and God was faithful. There was no way David was going to die. Well, leading up to this week's story, David's best friend Jonathan, he was killed in a battle against the Philistines. King Saul, he fell on his own sword, and then David became the king of Israel. Well, boys and girls, David, he moved the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, to Jerusalem, which was a cause for a joyous celebration. And David settled into his royal palace. God blessed David, and he gave him peace from his enemies. But when David looked around, he realized something wasn't right. David thought to himself, why am I living in this great palace when the Ark of God, when God's presence is dwelling in a tent? It just didn't add up. Well, David made plans to fix this problem, but you know what, boys and girls? God had other ideas, which were actually way better than David's plans. And that is the point of this week's story. Let's watch this video together and see what God has for us in this week's lesson.
God chose David to be the next king of Israel. King Saul had died, and God gave his people a time of peace. David lived in a beautiful palace in the city of Jerusalem. One day, David was talking with Nathan the prophet. David said, I live in a palace of nice cedar wood, but the Ark of God sits inside a tent. It hardly seemed fair. Shouldn't God have a nicer house than I do? David wanted to build a temple for the Ark of God. Nathan said, God is with you, do what you want. But God did not want David to do whatever he wanted. God wanted David to do what God wanted. That night, God gave Nathan a message for David. This is what God told Nathan to say. David, are you going to build a house for me to live in? I brought my people out of Egypt. I gave them leaders to guide them. The entire time I have been with them, my house has been a tent. Did I ever ask anyone to build a temple for me? You used to be a shepherd, David, but I made you king. I helped you defeat your enemies, and my people now live peacefully in their own land. I promise you, David, that you and your descendants will be kings. When you die, one of your sons will be king. He will be a strong king, and no one will be able to take his kingdom away from him. He will build a house for me. I will love him, and I will never leave him. When your son dies, his son will be king. Someone in your family will be king forever. Nathan told David everything God said. David went into the tent he had set up for the Ark of the Lord. He sat down and prayed. God, I don't deserve anything you have done for me, and you promised to do so much more. You are so great. There is no one like you. You chose the Israelites to be your own people. You rescued them from slavery in Egypt. God, please keep your promises. I know your words are always true. God promised David that every future king of Israel would come from David's family, and David's kingdom would last forever. God kept his promise by sending his son, Jesus, as one of David's descendants. Jesus is our king who will rule over God's people forever.
Wow, boys and girls, did you see that? God is awesome. David wanted one thing. He thought he was going to do God a great favor by building him this great temple. But God made an even better promise to David. And he was gracious to David and said, you know what, David? Every king from now on is going to come from your family. There will not be another king of Israel who would not be a relative of you, David. What an awesome promise. And you know what? We're going to see in a few weeks that God was faithful and he kept his promise. David's son, Solomon, becomes the next king of Israel. And we're going to see, boys and girls, that Solomon's son becomes king. And so on and so on until one day David's great grandson Jesus comes to the earth. And Jesus, because he never dies, he never will die, is king forever. And boys and girls, he doesn't just rule over an earthly temple. He rules, as we saw in our big picture question, he rules perfectly over the entire universe. He rules over this earth, and he rules in the hearts of his children. Wow, what a blessing. What an awesome gift to David. Well, this week's verse comes from the Psalms. And Psalms 145:13 tells us exactly. It reminds us of the truth that Jesus' rule, Jesus' kingship will reign forever. It will never be dethroned. So let's take a look at our week's verse together. Psalm 145:13 says this: Thy kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and thy dominion endureth throughout all generations. Boys and girls, this is a perfect verse that goes along with our big picture question. How long is everlasting, boys and girls? It's forever. It lasts forever. And that is how long Jesus' kingdom will last. His dominion, his rulership, how long does it endure? It endures throughout all generations. Every generation of people are under the rulership of our King Jesus. What an awesome, comforting verse that we can cling on to. That though there may be kings, there may be presidents, there may be people in power on this earth, all of them must bow the knee to King Jesus' rulership and his dominion as he perfectly rules over the entire universe as the King of Kings. Well, speaking of our big picture question, let's see how much you guys remember from this week's lesson as we start our Bible story trivia. All right, our first question is our big picture question. It's worth 8 points this week, and it is, how is Jesus the perfect king? Do you remember what we've been saying that answers that question? Well, we've seen that Jesus is the perfect king because he perfectly rules over the universe as the King of Kings. That's a lot of words, but I hope you're getting it by now. Question number 2, and this one is worth 5 points. What did David want to build for the Ark of God? In this week's story, we saw that David did not think it was right for him to live in this big palace, but for the Ark of God to dwell in a tent. And so what did David want to build for the Ark of God? Well, the answer is he wanted to build a temple. David thought it was appropriate for the Ark of God to stay in a temple. Question number 3. And this one's worth 4 points. What was the name of the prophet who told David what God said about building the temple? David had these big plans, but this prophet heard from God, and he told David that God actually had other plans. Do you remember the name of that prophet? Well, I think you do. The answer is Nathan. The prophet Nathan. All right, question number 4. And this one is worth 8 points. In God's response to David, who did God say would one day build the temple for God? We saw that David wanted to build the temple, but Nathan heard from God that that was not going to happen. God actually said someone else would build the temple one day. Do you remember from this week's story who that was? Well, we'll see this in a few weeks, but it was actually David's son. David's son Solomon would be the one who would actually build the temple for the Ark of God. All right, last question. Question number 5, worth 5 points. The answer's found in this week's verse. How long will David's grandson Jesus rule as king? Boys and girls, we saw that God promised to David that someone from his family would always be ruling as king. Well, eventually David's great-great-great-great-grandson Jesus would come onto the earth. And for how long did this week's verse say that Jesus would rule as king? I think this one may be pretty easy for you. We know that Jesus will reign forever. His dominion is from everlasting to everlasting. It is forever, and he will never, ever, ever be dethroned. Wow, isn't it a comfort to know that King Jesus reigns forever? No matter what is going on in this world, we have confidence that our good King, our King that is in control, our powerful King Jesus, he will never, ever be dethroned. He will always reign. That is wonderfully comforting news to those of us who are children of this great King. Now, boys and girls, that brings us to an important question. How can we know that we are a child of this King who will reign forever? Well, we've seen it in past weeks, and we're going to say it every single week. We can be a child of this King by putting our faith in what our King has done for us on the cross. We've seen in this week's big picture question that Jesus is perfect. He has never sinned. And Jesus cannot have fellowship with those of us who are his enemies, those of us who have sinned, because he's perfect. But God, in his wisdom, he made a way where he sent his son Jesus, who was perfect, to take our punishment for the sin that we deserve to be punished for. And Jesus took our sin on the cross, and in exchange, we get Jesus's perfection. So now, God doesn't see us as sinners. He sees us just as his son, and he can welcome us into his family as accepted children of God. Wow, that is the gospel, and that is the greatest story ever told. You know what, boys and girls? David needed the gospel. He needed Jesus to be the sacrifice for his sins. And every king of Israel that would live on would need that same sacrifice until King Jesus comes and is the perfect king forever. No king ever needed after. Jesus perfectly reigns over the universe as the King of Kings. And we are confident and comforted as we are his children. Well, I think we should end today's lesson by singing praises to our King, because he is the only one who can make us right with God. He is the only one who can give us the forgiveness of sins. And he is the only one worthy of our praise. So I want us to sing one of my favorite songs that we've learned this year. It's called Only One. I hope you guys remember it. Sing along. And then next week we'll continue with the story of David. But until then, enjoy this song, and we'll see you next week at Friendship Kids.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. He chose and called you out, a people for his own. One way he has ordained, a covering for sinners' shame. A sacrifice must pay, for only blood atones. Only one left his throne, only one begotten Son, only one spotless Lamb could sacrifice. Only one power can save, only one empty grave, only one narrow way, Jesus Christ. Hear, O guilty man, your soul is lost and judgment comes. For by one man who sinned, death entered in the world. But God so loved the world, he gave to us his only Son, the price to pay and death to overcome. Only one left his throne, only one begotten Son, only one spotless Lamb could sacrifice